The smell hit me before I even got through the door. Not blood. You get used to blood. This was something older. Lard and 5 spice from the kitchen 2 floors below, and underneath it, something sweet and copper that doesn't belong in any kitchen. I pushed the door open with my elbow and there was Eddie Crane, late of the Chicago Tribune, still sitting in his chair like he'd just nodded off after a long shift. Except nobody nods off with their hands tied behind them. And nobody sweats that much blood through a white shirt unless something went very, very wrong. There was a cross on the wall behind him. Drew it careful. Took his time. Hi. I'm Detective Jack Mahoney. 40 years Chicago PD, 12 of them on homicide before they moved me sideways to a desk that I mostly ignored. My hands shake now when the cold gets into them. The cold gets into them a lot in this city. My memory doesn't shake. My memory is the one thing I've got left that still works the way God intended. I'm recording these cases because somebody ought to. Because the files get lost, or sealed, or burned, and the dead don't get a say in any of it. Eddie Crane didn't get a say. This is me giving him one. 40 years late, maybe. But here it is. September 1945. The war was 3 weeks finished. 3 weeks. The city was still drunk on it. You couldn't walk down State Street without someone handing you a paper flag or a bottle of something and wanting to sing. Boys were coming home on trains and the platforms were chaos. Women crying, kids who didn't recognize their fathers, fathers who didn't recognize themselves. The papers were full of words like asterisk triumph asterisk and asterisk grateful asterisk and asterisk new dawn. Asterisk. The Tribune ran 6-column headlines every other day. Eddie Crane was the one Tribune man who wasn't writing that story. I found out later what he'd been writing instead. Not that night. That night I just had a body, a locked back room above the Golden Lotus restaurant on Wentworth Avenue, and a cross on the wall drawn in blood so carefully it looked stenciled. The owner of the Golden Lotus was a small man named Mr. Yi, who'd been in Chinatown since before I was born and who looked at me with the polite, practiced blankness of a man who has survived a very long time by giving nothing to people with badges. He told me in careful English that the room was rented by the week, cash, to a man who came and went through the alley stairs. He hadn't seen Eddie Crane before tonight. He hadn't seen anyone go up. He hadn't heard anything. I believed about half of that. The room was small. A table, 2 chairs, a hanging bulb on a cord. Eddie's hat was on the floor beside the table like it had been knocked off his head in a hurry. His notepad was gone. I went through his coat, his jacket, every pocket. Nothing. Someone had wanted those notes badly enough to take them. That told me everything about the motive and nothing at all about the man. I crouched down and looked at the cross. 3 feet high, maybe. Vertical stroke, then horizontal. Done with 2 fingers, not a brush, not a cloth. You could see the drag marks, the pressure points, where the fingers lifted and reset. Patient work. Deliberate work. I'd been on the job 22 years at that point. I'd seen signatures before, the thing a certain kind of killer can't stop himself from leaving. But this one bothered me in a way I couldn't name yet. It didn't feel like pride. It felt like something else. It felt like a receipt. Eddie Crane was 34 years old. He'd covered the Pacific in 43 and 44 as a correspondent, came back with a cough that wouldn't quit and eyes that looked like they were always focused on something that wasn't in the room. His editor at the Tribune, a man named Hargrove who chain-smoked camels and had the voice of a man who'd been arguing since birth, told me Eddie had been working a story for 6 weeks. Wouldn't say what it was. Brought notes home, kept them separate from the office files. He said he didn't want it to walk, Hargrove told me. He was nervous. Not grief nervous. Scared nervous. There's a difference. I asked him to be specific. He looked at his cigarette for a long time. He said the story touched people who knew where the files were kept. That was it. That was all I got from Hargrove that first day. I got more from him later, but by then it didn't matter the way I thought it would. I spent the next 2 days working out Eddie Crane's last week. He'd been seen in Chinatown 3 times that I could confirm. Once by a laundry owner on Archer who remembered him because he'd been asking about a warehouse on the canal. Once by a kid who ran errands for half the businesses on Wentworth, who told me a white man in a Tribune press badge had been going in and out of the Golden Lotus for a month. And once by a woman. Her name was Helen Marsh. She was a secretary at the city clerk's office, and she'd been Eddie's contact for whatever he was building. I found her name on a scrap of paper tucked inside the band of his hat, the hat that had fallen on the floor. Small mercy. Whoever cleaned out his pockets either missed it or didn't know it was there. Helen Marsh was 26, smart, and terrified in a way that she was holding together with both hands. She met me in a diner on Michigan Avenue, sat with her back to the window, and told me that Eddie had been documenting war contracts. Specifically, supply contracts awarded between 1942 and 1945 to 3 companies with Chicago addresses. Shell companies, she said. Fronts. The money had moved somewhere and Eddie had been tracing where. Where? I asked. She looked at the table. He thought it went to people who were supposed to be fighting the war. I lit a cigarette and waited. Officers, she said, quieter. Quartermaster Corps. And some people here. Civilians. Connected people. Connected people. There's a phrase that covers a multitude of sins in this city. I asked her who specifically and she shook her head hard, like she was shaking something loose that she didn't want to drop on the table between us. 3 days into the investigation, I got a phone call at my desk. 8 in the morning. I hadn't slept much. The voice was calm. Not threatening calm. Business calm. The kind of voice that signs papers. He told me his name, a name I'm not going to say here, not because I'm afraid of him, because he's been dead 20 years, but because his son is still alive and I'm too old to get into that. And he told me that Eddie Crane's death was a tragedy, a real tragedy, and that he hoped I'd catch whoever did it. And then he told me that there was an envelope in my car. I went to the lot and looked and there it was, under the wiper blade. $500 in 20s. In 1945, that was 8 months of my salary. I stood there in the cold with that envelope in my hand for a long time. The lake was making its November sound off to the east, that low grinding moan it makes when the weather turns. I thought about my wife Eleanor's face when she found out my partner Kowalski had been killed in '39, the way she looked at me when I walked in the door that night, the specific quality of her relief that it wasn't me. I put the envelope in my pocket. I'm telling you that plainly. I didn't keep it, but I held onto it for 2 days before I turned it in, and I've thought about those 2 days more than I've thought about most things. That's what I want you to know. That it wasn't simple. The wrong man's name was Thomas Reedy. He was a veteran, 28 years old, worked as a loader at a warehouse on the canal, the same canal Eddie had been asking about. He had a record, 2 drunk and disorderly, 1 assault charge from 1941 that got dropped. He'd been seen near the Golden Lotus the week before the murder by 2 people I trusted. And when I brought him in and sat across from him in the box, he was sweating before I said a word. He lied about where he was the night of the murder. Not cleverly. He said he'd been with his brother, gave me an address, and I checked the address and there was no brother. There was a woman who worked nights and definitely wasn't his sister. When I came back and pressed him on it, he folded fast. He'd been at the Golden Lotus, he said. But not that room. There was a card game in a room on the first floor, Mr. Yee's other enterprise, the one Mr. Yee had been careful not to mention. Reedy had been there from 9 o'clock until well past midnight. 4 other men could vouch for him. I checked it. It held. I sat in my car outside Reedy's rooming house and smoked half a pack and tried to put it back together. I had the right building, wrong floor, wrong man. I'd lost 2 days. The thing about chasing the wrong suspect isn't just the time you lose. It's the way it knocks your confidence loose. You start second-guessing the things you were certain about, because you were certain about this, too. What turned it was the cross. I'd been bothered by it since the first night. I'd seen it in my sleep. That careful, two-fingered work. The pressure points. I talked to a priest. Don't laugh, I've solved 2 cases talking to priests, and he told me that the cross drawn that way, that ratio of vertical to horizontal, wasn't a Christian cross. Not exactly. He'd seen something like it in religious iconography from the Pacific, specifically from the Philippines. I went back to Helen Marsh. I showed her a sketch I'd made of the cross and asked if Eddie had ever mentioned it. She went very still. And then she told me about a man named Victor Salcedo. Salcedo had been Eddie's source, a Filipino-American soldier who'd served as a translator in the Quartermaster Corps and who had documents, real documents, invoices, transfer orders, that showed where the contract money had gone and whose signatures were on the orders. He'd been trying to get the story out for a year. Eddie had finally made contact through a veterans organization in Chinatown. Where is Salcedo now? I asked. Helen looked at me with those careful, held-together eyes. He died, she said, in August, 3 days before the war ended. The Army had it as a training accident. Fort Sheridan. She didn't believe that, and neither did I. Not for a second. I checked the Fort Sheridan report. It was clean and thin and told me nothing except that someone had written it to tell me nothing. I talked to 2 men who'd known Salcedo at the Veterans Organization. One of them remembered that Victor had a habit, a nervous habit, something he'd picked up in the Pacific. When he was tense, he'd trace shapes on whatever surface was near him. A cross, the man told me. Just a simple cross. 2 fingers. I stood there on Wentworth Avenue in November wind and understood what the mark on the wall meant. It wasn't the killer's signature. It was a message. Someone had drawn it for Salcedo. Asterisk, I know he told you. I know what you have. Asterisk, or maybe something simpler. Something more like a name spoken in a language only 2 people spoke. The killer had known Victor Salcedo. Had known his habit. Had wanted whoever found the body to understand the connection, or had wanted to obscure it by making it look like a signature, like a calling card, like some lunatic leaving art on a wall. Make it strange enough, it becomes the story. The story becomes the case. The case goes nowhere. I spent 3 more weeks pulling at every thread I had. I identified a man. I'm not using his name here, either, and I'll explain why in a moment. A man who'd served as a logistics officer in the Pacific, who was now working for the city, who had been seen once near the Golden Lotus and who had a connection to 2 of the 3 shell companies Eddie had documented. I had no physical evidence. Eddie's notes were gone. Helen Marsh left Chicago in December 1945 and I never found out where she went. Hargrove at the Tribune killed the story. Told me a week after the murder that the files Eddie had given him were incomplete and unverifiable and the paper's lawyers had advised against running anything. I went to see Hargrove one more time. He looked like a man who was sleeping about as well as I was. I asked him who had called the lawyers. He looked at his cigarette. He looked at the wall. He looked at anywhere that wasn't me. Let it go, Mahoney, he said. There's no story left to print. I turned in the $500. I filed my report. I listed the cases open and unsolved and watched my lieutenant look at the paper and then look at me with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite warning but was something in between. The specific Chicago expression that means asterisk, you know how this goes. Asterisk. I knew how it went. I'd known since September. The man I believe killed Eddie Crane was named. No. I said I wouldn't. He died in 1962. Heart attack, the paper said. Nice obituary. Civic contributions. Survived by a wife and 2 sons. The son is alive. He has kids. They don't know what their grandfather did, or what their father's father was, or how many men had to stay quiet so that man could live a clean life in a clean house and get a nice obituary in the paper that his victim used to work for. I think about Eddie Crane sometimes when I read the Tribune. I think about Victor Salcedo, who died 3 days before the war he'd served and was officially over, in a training accident that wasn't, at a fort 15 miles from the city that ate him. I think about the cross on the wall and what it cost someone to draw it, whether it was grief or warning or both. I think about the envelope. I think about my hands on it, standing in that lot with the lake making its November sound, and how long 2 days can be when you're deciding what kind of man you are. Eleanor asked me about it once, years later. Not directly. She never did anything directly. It was one of the things I loved about her. She asked me if there was ever a case I wished I'd walked away from. I said no. That was the second time in that case I didn't quite tell the truth. The files are probably gone. The physical evidence, whatever there was of it, is gone. Helen Marsh is probably gone by now, wherever she ended up. Hargrove died in 1958. It's just me and the memory of that room. The lard and 5 spice from below. The careful cross on the wall. Eddie Crane in his chair, still as a man who just stopped being a person and started being a problem that needed to disappear. He was trying to tell the truth about the war. That was all. He came back from the Pacific, he found a source, and he tried to do what reporters are supposed to do. The city was 3 weeks into celebrating when they killed him. The confetti was still in the gutters. The case is unsolved. Open, technically. You want to pick it up, be my guest. The file number is in the Chicago PD archives, assuming the archives still have it, assuming it hasn't walked. I'm not holding my breath. But someone should know.